All right, the first chapter of our text talks about why we use statistics and criminal justice. So first we want to think about who uses statistics and where do those statistics come from. So statistics are used by the general public anytime we see a story in the news or we hear someone say something like, XYZ is causing crime. So the general public, people who run agencies, and people who make policy. And then those statistics come from research done by academics as well as people in both government and private sector. So we want to start by making sure we understand some basic terms that we're going to use throughout the semester. So let's start first with the concept of a variable. Variable is a characteristic that differs from either one point in time to another or one person to another. So that could be anything from age, social class, unemployment, population. So thinking about age could vary from person to person, or age varies with one individual person over time. Now, not every characteristic is going to vary. Some are constant. Researchers also not only specify the variables they're studying, but also the unit of observation. The unit of observation is the element being studied, for example, an individual person. Sometimes researchers focus on aggregates, the ways in which measures vary across entire collections of people. So, for example, how many homicides happen in a metropolitan area. We're also going to look at and investigate hypotheses. So a hypothesis is a statement of a relationship between two or more variables. Okay, we're always going to have a dependent variable and generally several independent variables. Now, the dependent variables depend, their outcome depends on the independent variable. So independent variables are causes and dependent variables are effects or outcomes. So research can take different forms. The experiment is probably something you're familiar with from taking science classes in high school. So generally this is going to be a type of research where we're manipulating one or more independent variables. So we will have an experimental group. That's a group that's being manipulated, and the independent variable is assigned to this group. The control group is not being manipulated, and we're going to withhold that independent variable from this group. All other initial differences between the experimental and control groups are eliminated by randomly assigning people to the groups. Now, we can't really do experiments in criminal justice for a variety of ethical reasons. Systematically using or withholding a treatment may have harmful effects. So, for example, we might want to determine whether or not child abuse leads to criminal behavior, but it would obviously be highly unethical to randomly assign people to experimental groups and control groups and then to inflict child abuse upon one group to see what happens to them. So Levin and Thomas conducted an experiment to test the effect of racial identity on the police on perceptions of police brutality. So what they used 3 videos, which simulated a black male suspect being arrested by 2 police officers. And each video differed in one way. In one video, the race of the arresting officers were both white. In one video, they were both black. And in one video, one was white and one was black. The tapes were randomly shown to respondents, 28 white students and 33 black college students. And then respondents were asked to estimate the degree of violence and brutality employed by the arresting officers. And it turned out that their perceptions of brutality were influenced by the officers' racial identity. So whether or not they saw the police officers as brutal depended on the police officer's race. Now, we might also use what's called a quasi experiment. So instead of using a control group, we have a comparison group. In the comparison group, the people in that group are matched in important respects to those of the experimental group. Now, this is much more ethically sound, but it is less rigorous than a true experiment. Now, Dew and Donay in 2008 did a study of Megan's Law. That's a quasi-experiment. We obviously cannot ethically assign sex offenders to either an experimental or a control group. So what they did was they used a retrospective, looking backwards, quasi-experimental design. So they compared the recidivism rates of 155 high-risk sex offenders released from Minnesota prisons, so this is a group subject to notification, with two comparison groups. 125 who were released prior to notification, and those whose location was not disclosed because they were not subject to notification. And they looked at their recidivism rates for all three groups for 8 years. Minnesota community notification does reduce recidivism as measured by arrest, conviction, and incarceration for new offenses. But they're also not able to control for all possible differences in community-based treatment and people's historical factors. We can also do a survey. A survey is retrospective research. We're looking at the effects of independent variables on dependent variables, and they're recorded after they have already occurred. Variables are not manipulated, and subjects are not assigned to groups at random. But it is much more difficult to establish cause and effect. In order to establish cause and effect, we have to be able to show that one thing occurred before the other. This does allow us to look at a much larger number of independent variables, and we can make sure that we are surveying people in a way that makes the sample much more representative and therefore able to be generalized to the population as a whole. So Palmer wanted to look at the relationship between frustration and aggression, and he interviewed the mothers of 51 convicted murderers and found many more frustrating circumstances in the early lives of these killers than in the lives of their brothers who had not killed anyone. They had been subject to more serious illnesses, operations, accidents, beatings, physical defects, frightening experiences, and disapproval from their peers. We can also conduct what's called a meta-analysis. This is research that combines the results obtained in a number of previous studies. And what they're doing is they're looking for an effect size, a measure of the extent to which the relationship exists in the population. The goal here is to possibly be able to end the debate in the literature or confirm the validity of an important idea. We can do what's called a content analysis. This is where we describe the content of previously produced messages. That could be books, magazines, newspapers, films, etc. So a 2012 content analysis looked at substance abuse in 90 top grossing teen-oriented films. What they did was they coded 609 characters from the films. They found that substance users were portrayed in a positive light and substance use was free of consequences. We can also do what's called participant observation. This is where we participate in the daily lives of people that we're studying. And you could do this openly, where the people know that you're conducting research, or covertly, where they don't know that you're conducting research. So let's think about the major sources of data in criminology and criminal justice. So we have victimization surveys, and we have the UCR. And also along with the UCR, we have NIBRS, which is data we're going to be using this semester. So the NCVS is our crime victimization survey, right? And this is where we survey individuals about their experiences being victims of crime. Whereas the UCR is reporting information on crimes that are reported to the police. So why are we testing hypotheses? Well, just because something seems like it's common sense doesn't mean that's actually what's happening. Okay, and common sense observations are often based on narrow, biased preconceptions and generally our own personal experiences. So what do we know about mass murderers? Well, some of you have taken a class on mass shootings and have taken the homicide class, so you might know a little bit more about mass murderers. But generally the public thinks they're insane, they're loners, they're strangers to their victims. But research on 42 mass killers shows that this is not actually correct. And how do we know that? We know that by doing research. So what are the stages of criminal justice research? First, we need to develop hypotheses. What do we think the relationships are between a set of variables? Then we need to develop some instruments. How are we going to measure those things? Collect the data, analyze the data, interpret those results, and communicate them. Now, one thing we're going to talk about throughout the semester is 3 different levels of measurement. And you want to make sure you understand these because knowing how something is measured and the level of measurement is going to determine what types of statistics we can use. So nominal level variables are variables that we could just name or label. We can't put them in any order. Ordinal variables can go in an order, but the difference from one thing to the next might not be the same. Whereas interval ratio level variables can be ordered and the distance between them is exact and can be measured. So nominal level variables are exclusive and exhausted. So do you have a criminal record? Yes, no. Race, whether or not you graduated high school. Sex, gang membership, personality type. Ordinal level variables include things like our socioeconomic status, our degree of tolerance, income. And then interval and ratio level variables, we know the exact distance between things. So the length of a prison sentence, how many prior convictions. Ratio level variables can be compared with one another and have a true 0 point, something like age. Now, ordinal level data is often treated as interval level data, even though the difference is not always clear. We often choose to treat it as an interval level variable because it allows us to use more powerful statistical tools. So we also want to think about what can statistics do. They can describe and they can help us make decisions. So things that describe are things like averages, things we could put in graphs and tables, and frequency distributions, which we'll talk more about next week in chapter 2. Decisions are inferences and generalizations from a sample to a population. And this is where we start testing hypotheses to see what is the relationship between a set of variables. So descriptives, as I said, they're used to describe. Researchers often study hundreds, thousands, or even larger numbers. So this is generally, in this case, statistics often are defined as a set of techniques for the reduction of quantitative data to a small number that we can more easily explain. And as I mentioned, decision making is where we could test hypotheses. So let's take this hypothesis. Male college students are more likely than female college students to have tried marijuana. This hypothesis is tested at an urban university with 10,000 male and 10,000 female enrollees. 35 out of 100 males and 15 out of 100 females had tried marijuana. But we have to test this for statistical significance. Is this an actual real difference? So in this case, we're using statistics to make a decision. An important note to think about in terms of rounding, whenever we're doing math with statistics, we don't want to round until we get to our final answer. And our final answer, we want to round 2 more decimal digits than what was in the original score. And that wraps up chapter 1, why and how we use statistics in criminal justice.